think everybody should strive to be a little more vulnerable in the world. Vulnerability builds empathy, and empathy is what allows us to connect on a deeper level. It's only when we can open up to ourselves that we're able to heal. Yet, being vulnerable also only brings pain. It's not like it's difficult to open up. I mean, anybody could do that. No, what makes it hard is what happens after. The realities you face, the truths you must accept, and so we end up hiding underneath this blanket of emotion. What makes a character emotional? Well, that's kind of a trick question. Sure, a character can have emotional scenes that tap into a character's dark past or that reveal hidden traits unbeknownst to the audience. But characters themselves aren't emotional. Rather, they tend to show their emotions more consistently because emotions themselves aren't a thing, but instead a process.
Emotion is a process. It's not just a kind of unidimensional event. I was sad. There is a trigger to our sadness, there's an experience of our sadness, and there's a response to that sad feeling.
Right, so the process of emotions is an infinitely more complicated scenario that honestly I could care less about. I mean, yeah, emotions are important, it's what makes us human, but there's not much we can learn from the process of how we go through emotions. Instead, I'd rather look at the smaller picture, which is in our vulnerability, how we choose to deal with those emotions. It's usually in vulnerability that a character is able to develop. It's how we create change within ourselves for the better or for the worse. And it's the key to a great character. So being inspired by Johnny Starr, no seriously though, love you Johnny. He's never watching this. I think I want to take a deeper dive into the world of emotional characters and pick out my favorite. Thorfinn. It's funny because normally a revenge story is in direct opposition to vulnerability. In their haste for revenge, the protagonist will hide any emotions they feel in order to dedicate every piece of their being into vengeance. Usually the story ending when they finally get what they want, but not feeling anything. No relief, no reassurance of ideals, not even the smallest hint of accomplishment, just emptiness, with nothing to fill the void because you decided to be invulnerable to the fact that nothing will bring that person back. Well, Vinland Saga isn't really like that, and it's why I think Thorfinn's revenge story has a lot to say about how we interpret our emotions. But don't be confused. Vinland Saga is a revenge story. We go through the same exact tropes that every revenge story in the past century has captured within the first season of Vinland Saga. The only difference is that the real story starts after the revenge arc. Thorfinn's character has to deal with the consequences of being invulnerable for all his life. The heinous acts, the willingness to be manipulated, everything that he went through in the prologue is just a context to the main story. A story of which is meant to put him through a process of vulnerability, a process of healing, and eventually a process of learning. Thorfinn would be a great character to display how vulnerability in life allows you to develop into something greater. But at the same time, it's not the perfect role model that I'd like others to learn from. Thorfinn was a character who immediately submitted to blocking out his emotions, and while he ended up learning from it, that spur of invulnerability still caused too much harm in the bigger picture. Going freaks. Well, I think we all know where I'm going with this. How could I make a video on anime emotions and not mention this scene? Gon's character is the essence of child innocence, which gives the moment that much more oomph. His innocence has been taken away from him when he learns about the death of his teacher, and everything explodes. A child inherently is vulnerable just in terms of lack of exposure. They haven't experienced enough in life to give them that understanding of what's happened. And so Gon being exposed to an emotion so heavy jumpstarts his maturity, and the physical representation is what we see in front of us. Honestly, Gon isn't anywhere near my favorite emotional character because I don't really look for him to give me emotional scenes in Hunter x Hunter as much as I would from the other characters like Kurapika or Killua. But he has a Hall of Fame emotional moment, so I feel like I had to at least mention him. Rudo. Now, here's an interesting submission, because the world of Gachiakata is so full of emotion, the way it speaks to us through the art. They were black balls, floating black balls. And they came right into our butt. There's a very specific scene that feels perfect in portraying the protagonist's emotions, and that's in Rudo's betrayal. It's the turning point of the series. But to understand it, you're gonna need some context. The place Rudo lives in is called the Sacred Land, which is a society that hates trash. The thought of living with filth is the worst scenario they could imagine. So they do everything in their power to separate themselves from the filth by dumping it into the abyss, a dark, endless void in which they remove all of their trash. And it's not only trash that constitutes as filth, but also humans. Criminals of any kind were not welcome in the Sacred Land. So in order to separate themselves from the filth of humanity, they would exile them to the slums. Two towns separated by a single wall, defining the acceptable and the unacceptable. Well, Rudo lies with the unacceptable folk, which is why his betrayal feels so emotionless, because the story takes advantage of the one vulnerability that Rudo showed, and that was in his relationship with her. He's being thrown into the abyss for the murder of Regto, his father, and as he reaches out looking for a lifeline of any kind, he realizes that it was always going to end like this. There was never a chance for him in the Sacred Land because he was never even a part of it. The only connection he felt was real had been severed, and so there's nothing left for him, nothing but hate. Hatred to those who deemed him as filth, seeing only hypocrisy anytime they spoke, and so he dedicated the rest of his life to not only seeing his father's killer brought to justice, but bringing the rest of the Sacred Land down with him. This scenario is where Rudo's emotions and vulnerability were taken advantage of, taking a turn for the worse, giving us a commentary on not only the situation he's found himself in, but the greater message that society sends to those who aren't seen as acceptable. Rudo's character depicts how being vulnerable can ultimately backfire on you, and how hard it is to gain that vulnerability back. The only problem is, the story isn't there yet. Maybe in another year or two, I'd be able to put Rudo as my favorite emotional character, but the character arc that we're all waiting for him to experience just hasn't come yet. So until then, I just can't make him my favorite. Yuji Itadori. Jujutsu Kaisen is a world where opening up is met with nothing but exploitation. To share a connection with somebody is begging for someone to take it away. It's because of this that most of the... And my mic stand just broke. It's because of this, most of the characters in the series don't see any value in relationships. It's kind of the nature of a shonen series to revolve around the concept of the power of friendship. And JJK provides a refreshing take on the shonen genre as a whole, where friendships are seen more as a constraint than anything else, giving the perfect setup for the protagonist to take on the enduring task. While most become Jujutsu sorcerers out of a place of revenge or wealth, Yuji was simply on a search for friends. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that with Sukuna's fingers and the Jujutsu head clans, but at the same time, it wasn't complicated to him at all. His grandfather died with nobody around him and told Yuji to not end up like him, old and alone. So friendships were a necessary in Yuji's life. They weren't limiters to his power, but instead a way to strive for more. Once again, the world of Jujutsu Kaisen doesn't take kindly to relationships. So what we get is a perspective of how someone experiences both the joy in gain as well as the sorrow in loss, which is such a unique and way more realistic way of showing vulnerability within the show. Not holding its punches, but instead allowing the viewer to experience the loss with the character. So in terms of depiction of vulnerability, I think Jujutsu Kaisen does it the best. But there is one problem, and that's Yuji. He never really changes, and instead he just internalizes the emotions, carrying them with him as his motivation, which doesn't feel like the best way to go about it, but honestly I think that's the point the series is trying to make. Jujutsu Kaisen loves to show that nothing in life will ever go your way, and in an entire world that's against you, sometimes you will falter. But what matters is what you take with you from those losses.
Is that it?
Yeah.
I don't know. It doesn't really feel like you.
I mean, like, bro, you spend so long writing a script, and then all of a sudden over a month has passed since you last uploaded a video, and I don't know, bro. I just want to get it over with, no cap. I feel like the passion's just gone for this video. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, right? I'll just drop this for now and just hope it does well.
I just want to get it over with. Last time you were talking about the script, you were telling me how great the video was going to be, bruh. Just take some accountability. Like, the worst thing for your viewers is for you to release something and it doesn't feel complete. Right?
Accountability. Huh. Mob and Reagan. The praise I try and give to Mob Psycho will never be enough. It feels so complete in how it's able to tell its story to us, because at face value, Mob Psycho is exactly what it seems like, a gag story about an overpowered psychic navigating through life. But it becomes so much more in the way that it explores and develops different themes as we progress through the story. But these themes aren't your average tropes. Instead, it's a bounty of building blocks that are used to complete the story of Mob. But that doesn't really feel apparent until we arrive at a certain storyline, the story of a student and his master. This is the story of Mob and Reagan. Reagan comes from a job where they take advantage of their customers. They sweet talk them into a probably not so even deal and then strike just to make ends meet. But eventually Reagan gets tired of the job, feeling there's more to life than taking advantage of people. He begins looking for his purpose, and so after settling down on his own, he reads a newspaper ad about a psychic tool. Lacking in money and motivation, he begins his business, Spirits and Such, which specializes in spirit cleansing. And yet there's one problem. He has no powers. He's a con artist at heart, and so he rides the wave as long as possible. And after a long 4 years, he decides it's time to recalibrate, get his life back on track, and become somebody. And that's when he meets Mob.
So how may I... Oh, it's just a kid.
In a stroke of luck, he's found somebody who actually has powers, and so he makes him his disciple. But as the story progresses, Reagan finds himself taking advantage of Mob, manipulating his student to do whatever's best for him. Every now and then, Reagan gives a hint of genuine advice or teaching, but in the end, none of it's genuine. It's all an act to keep Mob exactly where he wants him. On the other end, Mob's been lost for a while as a child, always searching for somebody who was like him, and that's when he found Reagan, a self-proclaimed psychic who was able to guide him in the world of spirits. But in his heart of hearts, Mob was just afraid of being alone, so he stuck with Reagan for a while. But as we see throughout the show, all children grow up eventually.
Man, you were so gullible. Would you grow up already? Seriously, Mob.
Mob has found purpose in other things, and as a part of his growth, realized that he shouldn't be so dependent on a single person to define who he is. And so Reagan meets the confrontation with even more delusion. He believes he'll be okay. I mean, he survived this long before Mob came. What's so different now? Everything. So what does one do when they're stuck? They begin to look for purpose. He doesn't really know who he is, and he's far from becoming somebody. And so he leaves his current identity behind and begins branching out to almost every avenue of job you could think of, trying to figure out who he is. It's a cycle. Reagan is stuck in a loop and he doesn't know how to finish it. He keeps repeating the same process over and over and doesn't realize nor does he understand how to escape. As he stands at the lowest point he's ever been, he tries to remember, why am I here? What made him become a psychic in the first place? Was it his goal to become somebody in this world? How did he end up falling into the same trap he had in his previous job? I mean, at the end of the day, this job was only meant to be a side hustle, a stepping stone to where he really wanted to be. So why did he stay?
Back then, I couldn't help but admire this little kid that walked into my life. But I wanted something for myself, too.
Well, it was Mob. Reagan admired Mob in the way that he latched onto him. Mob just wanted to be seen, and in a similar way, so does Reagan. Becoming somebody is pointless if there's nothing for you to become someone for. Well, Mob was that someone for Reagan. The reason he's never been able to break the loop is because he was missing accountability. And so in the same way that Mob took accountability for being used by Reagan, Reagan takes accountability for not only taking advantage of Mob, but for never being vulnerable enough to allow change within himself. It's storylines like these that are sprinkled all throughout Mob Psycho that makes Mob and Reagan my favorite emotional characters in all of anime. Mob Psycho is a story of people gaining their identities, but a lot of the time you realize that being vulnerable within yourself truly can solve anything. And so we end up hiding underneath this blanket of emotion. But those brave enough to take the plunge and remove their blanket, embracing their emotions, end up becoming something different. Different in soul, different in body. They've become human. I don't know. I just want to get it over with. I feel like the passion's long gone. Fuck! Three takes. That's all it takes.